fresh out. You tuned into another prison talk. One of the viewers emailed us and asked who were the toughest guys in prison, who were the most feared. As far as the toughest guys in prison, there were a lot of tough guys in prison, but they didn't come off as tough in a sense where you heard about them being tough. You just knew they were tough because of how they carried themselves, or maybe in passing conversation you had heard about what they were about on the street. Nobody publicly talked about what they did on the street. If you heard about what somebody did on the street, it was usually through a second person, third person that knew about this person before they got locked up. One of the most gangster individuals I came across was Carmine Persico. He was the head of at one point, the Colombo crime family. He was in the same unit I was in Long Park USP. He was on the first tier. This was back in 2000. I didn't have very many conversations with him. I'm not going to pretend like I was kicking it with a mob guy, but Carmine was a mover and shaker. You could do your homework on him. I didn't know who he was when I first seen him. I just knew that he was a kind of a grandfatherly looking gentleman, quiet, kind of did his thing. And I was actually cool with one of the guys who used to look after him. And this individual used to let me look at like his DuPont registers, his Rob reports, some of his Wall Street journals. He would let me read afterwards. And that's how I kind of had the interaction with him. I never really sat down and had major conversation with him. But, there was a hi, what's up here and there. And that was about it. But he was quiet. He didn't speak a lot. He didn't, rah-rah. He watched his little shows. Nobody gave him any shit. Everybody respected him. And you look at his resume. He was a real gangster, And there were some other guys in there that were at a high level of, I would consider, gangster, mob type dude that you would have never known that they were those type of people on the street. Guys that when they got caught, they had millions of dollars buried in the wall of their houses. Dudes from Mexico who got caught up when the political situation changed. Their cartel got snatched up, and these dudes were super balling. And then when the other administration came in, their cartels went down, and the new ones came up. And there were a couple of those guys who got kind of thrown to the feds in there. And you didn't really try to, you didn't talk about like, oh man, I had this on the street, I was balling this. These guys never talked about it. You just would, after you maybe talk to somebody, maybe looking at cars or something, or talking about business, somebody else would kind of tap you, like another cat would be like, one of my Mexican partners would be like, hey man, that dude right there, that dude was balling, man. He was making like, dude, that dude was making a couple million a week. I'm like, what? Yeah, dude, that dude was balling down in Mexico. He was doing his thing, and that's how you knew it. But these dudes were power players, man. They didn't do a whole lot of working out. They weren't raw. They weren't doing any of that. They were quietly doing their time, and most likely working on some type of appeal or some type of attorney type situation, and that's how they did their time. And these guys were still balling. Even in prison, they had access to certain things, and they had resources, and there was quite a few people like that in the feds. The feds is a lot different than the state. The state, California in particular, very political. A lot of racism, a lot of gangs. I didn't do my time in the state. I only did youth authority time in California, and then my time was in the federal prison. And I've told my story a bunch of times, but the feds, you interact with multicultural people. I mean, you might be in there with a guy who was, running, a certain sect for a triad. You might run across a guy who was tied in with, the Korean mob, or, just a bunch of different characters in there. And like I said, none of these guys ever publicly talked about what they did. They would maybe mention, oh man, I had this car, I had maybe did this, had this, and, traveled here. And then you would just do your math. You're like, damn, the dude had this, he had that, he traveled here, he knew this guy. This guy, he's a real deal. He's a gangster. This guy was, then you see how people interact with him. And you kind of draw your own conclusions. But, another guy that stood out, and I don't know if I've talked about before, but, everybody knew that this guy wasn't no joke. This guy was a Cuban guy, and he had been locked up in the feds, I don't know, maybe since the 80s, man, when they had the whole Cuban thing, when they came over and they had the riots and stuff down in Florida. But they had a bunch of Cubans in the feds back in the 80s, and these guys, at one point I heard they had some riots and took over one of the penitentiaries. But this guy, he was an older cat. I was in my 20s. This guy's probably late 40s, early 50s, and I think his name was Peoples. But he was like one of those guys who wore glasses, quiet. It's kind of, you could tell he was in shape. I seen him working out a few times, in the gym. He was super lean, ripped, pull-ups, push-ups. He was doing all that stuff. And had a certain demeanor about himself. But he wasn't the type of person you want to really try to get close and be cool with. Certain people, when you know that they're killers, like bona fide, that they're gangsters, you tread lightly. You see them, but you don't want to become too personal. And a homie told me this because he said, man, look, you doing a dime. These dudes, man, they done been in here. They've done, a lot of time, and they got a lot of time, and they don't have nothing to lose. So watch yourself and who you make friends with. And so I was always careful of who I kicked it with too many times. If you hang out with a guy too many times during the week, he's going to expect you to hang out with him weekly, monthly, and then it becomes a problem when you try to break away. But this dude, only reason I had any type of interaction with him was because I used to work out in the gym too. When it was, weather was shitty outside, you go in there, you do pull-ups, push-ups and stuff, dips. And this dude, another guy had told me, like I said, these guys never told you how tough they are. But they said that guy, man, it's like, man, you don't want to ever owe that guy. Like if he gets a debt that somebody owes, it's a wrap. He's gonna come get his paper. And I'm like, what? They're like, yeah, man, that dude ain't no joke, man. He's quick to pull them knives, man. He'll shake a motherfucker quick, and yeah. When I heard that, I'm like, oh, and like I wasn't messing with no drugs or anything anyways, so I wasn't gonna put myself in any of those situations. I never got into smoking weed or trying to do any of that in prison or moving drugs, because man, dudes moving drugs is serious. You start moving drugs, man, you touch that stuff, and it's like touching a tar baby. You can't get it off your hands, and you got the police, you got other inmates hating on you. You got a lot of dudes, man, that are just in your business. So you don't want to get caught up in the drug scene. But yeah, that guy, he was serious, and I've heard of people that had owed him, and it wasn't good when he came to collect. It wasn't a good look. But he was a bona fide tough guy. There was a couple other dudes in there that you heard their name in passing. Dudes who are martial artists that would bust you upside the head. A couple guys I came across worked in the kitchen. There was a guy up in there. No joke. They said he had got down with the popos up in there. didn't go to the hole because the popo took his belt off. Him and the popo got down. Popo was big. He was a big dude, and they was chunking him up in there. And they said, he was tossed the popo around and pots and pans were flying. And I guess the other officers heard it and ran up in there, but they couldn't do nothing because, he couldn't hit the deuces because he didn't have his belt on. So, it was a consensual, throwdown. But you have those type of cats in there. You have police that will get down with you. They'll go in the back, let's get out. You want to talk all that mess? Let's handle it. And, at the USPs, that's what it's like. The USPs, which is considered like a level 4 in the state, you have dudes like that who are on major, I'll crack your head time, and the COs are gangsters up in there. It's just like literally like a gang, just like the dudes on the street are a gang. Probably have that tough guy handle, but they're very humble, and most of those guys, if they have a problem with you, they just gonna move in silence and stick you, and these guys, they're always covered up. The guys who are physically active, they're always covered up. You never see them peeling, or you don't know that, how strong they are because they work out, but they're very quiet. There's guys in there that had hit me up after I got out that were, about that life. And they used to say, man, I used to see you walking around, but, you was doing your thing, I was doing my thing. And said, but congratulations on your show. So a lot of these guys recognize, but I wasn't no tough guy in there. Wasn't pretending to be, there'd be so many different riffs and different dudes from different states that were about that life that you just had to, mind your own, man. Guys from Florida, savages, dudes who were, no joke, dudes from DC, some savages, dudes from Baltimore, dudes from New York, and there were guys in there who were really bona fide tough guys. I remember seeing there was some guys from I think they're from New Jersey or New York. Like I said, I didn't try to make too many acquaintances in there, but this cat, he, there's some Latin King dudes up in there, no joke. And one of the dudes had the crown tattooed on his head. He literally had it, walking around with that crown on his head. And I didn't know what a Latin King was before I got locked up, but I'm like, dudes kind of explained it to me, man, because I knew some Dominican cat in there and another Puerto Rican cat, and we were cool. And they used to kind of give me the 411 on, what some of these other guys, what they were into, because I used to do legal work with these guys. Me doing legal work kind of gave me a pass to talk to a lot of different dudes. I was able to talk to guys from Pennsylvania, dudes from Chicago, dudes from New York, to some degree. I wasn't busting spreads with them and nothing like that, but learned a lot about who was tough, and seen some guys who wanted to be tough guys come through there. And man, I'm telling you, I seen a guy come through there, and he was, walking around with no shirt on when he go into the shower. He was kind of swole, youngster, and I can't remember where he's from, but he was into that gang life. I want to say, I can't remember. I think he was a Crip or something from somewhere. And man, there was a lot of Crips at Long Park. I mean, serious gang members from LA, no joke. And a lot of Bloods too. There was quite a few Bloods, even Bloods from the East Coast. But this dude, when I seen him walking through there, kind of, bebopping, I'm like, dude, that dude ain't gonna last 2 weeks up in here, man. This is serious. He don't know where he's at. And sure enough, man, I don't know what he did, but he got rolled up. They rolled his ass up, man.